Macworld, Boston. August 6, 1997. Steve Jobs walked onto that stage with $90 million left in Apple's bank account, roughly 90 days of operating cash before the whole thing went dark forever. He looked calm. He shouldn't have been. Because what Jobs was about to announce wasn't a new product. It wasn't a revolutionary piece of technology that would save the company. It was a peace treaty with the one man the entire Apple faithful had spent a decade treating like the enemy. And when that face appeared on the giant screen behind him, Bill Gates, smiling, via satellite from Redmond, the crowd didn't cheer. They booed. Loudly. They hissed. Some of them looked away. And Steve Jobs, standing alone in the dark, had to convince 50 million Apple users that the devil had just become their savior. How does the most important technology company in American history get 90 days away from disappearing entirely? Apple Computer was born in a garage in Los Altos, California, in 1976. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak didn't invent the personal computer. They made people want one. The Apple II launched in 1977 and became the machine that put computing in American homes and classrooms. Revenue hit $117 million by 1980. The IPO that December minted more millionaires in a single day than any company in history up to that point. Then came 1984. The Macintosh. The famous Super Bowl ad that cost $900,000 and aired exactly once. It was supposed to change everything. And it did, just not fast enough, and not cheaply enough. By 1985, internal war had consumed Apple. John Sculley, the CEO Jobs himself had recruited away from Pepsi, maneuvered Jobs out of the Macintosh division. In September 1985, Jobs resigned. He took 5 senior engineers with him and started Next Computer. Apple sued him immediately. The decade that followed was a slow unraveling. Sculley chased the wrong markets. The Newton Personal Digital Assistant, launched in 1993, hyped as the future of computing, was buggy, expensive, and widely mocked. CEO after CEO cycled through. Gil Amelio arrived in 1996 promising a turnaround. Instead he oversaw Apple's worst stretch, losses of $816 million in fiscal year 1996 alone. Market share collapsed from 9% to under 4%. Windows 95 had arrived and consumed the world. Amelio's one consequential act was acquiring Next Computer in December 1996 for $429 million, which brought Steve Jobs back inside the building. And then came the decision that changed everything. The phone call happened in secret, sometime in late June 1997. Steve Jobs, not yet CEO, officially just an advisor, called Bill Gates directly. Not through lawyers. Not through intermediaries. Steve Jobs called Bill Gates. Jobs had been back inside Apple for roughly 6 months and what he had seen horrified him. The company was burning cash at a rate that defied comprehension. There was no coherent product strategy. The clone licensing program, which Sculley had initiated to let other manufacturers run Mac OS, was cannibalizing Apple's own hardware sales. Morale was shattered. Engineers were leaving. Key software developers were quietly abandoning the Mac platform because they couldn't see a future there. What Jobs needed, immediately, was a signal. Not just money, though money was critical, but a signal loud enough to stop the bleeding of developer confidence. He needed someone credible to stand up and say Apple would survive. There was only one company on earth that could credibly send that signal. Microsoft. The relationship between Apple and Microsoft was, at this point, one of the most litigated and bitterly contested in Silicon Valley history. Apple had sued Microsoft in 1988 over the visual interface of Windows, claiming Microsoft had stolen the look and feel of the Macintosh. The suit dragged for years before being dismissed in 1994. The wounds were still raw. But Jobs was not sentimental about wounds when survival was at stake. Gates, for his part, had reasons of his own. Microsoft's Office suite for Mac was genuinely profitable. Apple's collapse would trigger an antitrust catastrophe. Federal regulators already watching Microsoft would have no more credible argument for a competitive marketplace if Apple ceased to exist. Gates needed Apple alive. Not strong. Just alive. The deal they negotiated was announced on that August stage in Boston, and it had three components. Microsoft would invest $150 million in non-voting Apple stock. Microsoft would commit to releasing Office for Mac for a minimum of 5 more years. And Apple, quietly, with minimum fanfare, would settle all outstanding patent litigation between the two companies and agree to bundle Internet Explorer as the default browser on every Mac shipped. That last clause cost Apple something real. But Jobs barely flinched. He was buying time, not winning a war. When Gates appeared on that screen, 6 feet tall, beaming from Redmond, the crowd's reaction was visceral and immediate. Jobs let the booing wash over him. Then he said, quietly and deliberately, if we want to move forward and see Apple healthy and prospering again, we have to let go of a few things. We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. It was the most honest sentence Jobs ever spoke in public. Gil Amelio was gone by July 9, 1997, 3 weeks before the announcement, forced out by the board after 19 months and losses that totaled over $1 billion during his tenure. He received a severance package worth approximately $7 million. He wrote a book about his time at Apple called On the Firing Line. He felt, he would later say, that Jobs had orchestrated his removal. Jobs never publicly denied it. The Newton was killed. Jobs discontinued it in February 1998, eliminating the entire product division. Hundreds of engineers lost their jobs. Some of them were furious. The Newton had genuine believers, people who had devoted years of their lives to it. John Scully, who had championed the project with evangelical fervor, watched from the outside as his legacy was erased quietly and without ceremony. The Mac clone program was terminated in September 1997. Power Computing, the largest Mac clone maker, had been growing fast, dangerously fast, eating directly into Apple's market. Jobs killed the program and offered to buy Power Computing's Mac OS license back for $100 million. The deal closed. Power Computing shut down. Hundreds more jobs gone. The unexpected consequence that almost no one saw coming, Microsoft's $150 million investment, made in August 1997, was cashed out 18 months later at a profit. Microsoft made money on saving Apple. By the time Apple's stock had recovered enough for Microsoft to sell its stake, in late 1998 and early 1999, the investment had appreciated significantly. Gates had not done Apple a charity. He had done Apple a favor that paid him back. And Internet Explorer became the default Mac browser, a quiet victory for Microsoft that rankled Apple engineers for years. It would take Apple until 2003 to launch Safari and reclaim control of that relationship. Jobs himself took a salary of $1 per year when the board formalized his CEO role in January 2000. He accepted, however, a compensation package in stock options and eventually a Gulfstream jet that made him extraordinarily wealthy as the company recovered. The $1 salary was theater. It was also completely sincere. Both things were true simultaneously. What this story reveals is not really about Apple. It isn't really about Microsoft. It's about what happens when pride becomes the most expensive thing a company owns. For 12 years, Apple's identity was built in opposition. Opposition to IBM. Opposition to Microsoft. Opposition to conformity. That identity made for legendary advertising and ferocious customer loyalty. It also made it nearly impossible for Apple to make the pragmatic, undignified, genuinely humiliating choice that survival required. Jobs made that choice. He made it because he had been gone long enough to see Apple from the outside, to see it as a company that could die, not just a symbol that would endure. The exile that had humiliated him in 1985 turned out to be the education that saved the company in 1997. There is a pattern here that repeats across industries and across centuries. The founder who returns sees things the institution can no longer see. The organization has spent so much energy protecting its story that it has lost the ability to question it. Jobs walked back in and questioned everything: the products, the partnerships, the grudges, the entire theology of what Apple was supposed to mean. The $150 million mattered. But what mattered more was the willingness to stand in front of a hostile crowd and absorb their disappointment without flinching. Leadership, at its most elemental level, is not the ability to inspire people when everything is working. It is the ability to make the right call when the crowd is booing and the bank account says 90 days. Every organization eventually reaches its August 1997. The only question is whether anyone inside it is willing to pick up the phone.